Hello and welcome to Hot News Channel, where we analyze the breaking news. Today, we are undertaking a really critical deep dive into a sudden and, I think, defining global event. I'm talking, of course, about the U.S. military operation in Venezuela that has culminated in the capture and removal of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores.
This is so much more than just breaking news. It's a geopolitical earthquake, really. Our sources are all confirming that this action isn't some localized affair. No, this is a massive statement that just cuts right across the accepted norms of international law. It touches on the complexities of U.S. domestic politics and, really, at its core, this desperate ongoing struggle for global economic dominance. It demands a serious look.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to move past those initial shocking headlines and really unpack the deepest context and maybe the most profound implications of this whole event. We've got a significant stack of source material today. We have analysis detailing the military action itself, the stated legal justification.
Which was narco-terrorism, right?
Exactly. That was the line from Attorney General Pam Bondi almost immediately. But then we have extensive source material suggesting let's say, the much more complex underlying motivations: oil, geopolitics, and this frantic, high-stakes defense of the weakening U.S. dollar.
And what's truly fascinating when you dig into it is seeing how many critical global systems really just converged on Caracas in those early hours of January 3rd. We need to look at the sources detailing the swift and, frankly, scathing reaction from adversaries like China and Russia. And then there's the confusion, the kind of conflicted response from traditional U.S. allies like the European Union.
You're right.
And, maybe most importantly, the terrifying legal precedent this action sets for the future.
Yeah.
I mean, this event won't be contained to Venezuela. It establishes a new and, I would say, ruthlessly aggressive standard for how superpowers resolve economic threats.
So we have to tackle some fundamental and very difficult questions straight away. First, how exactly did this snatch and grab operation succeed with virtually no resistance?
That's the million-dollar question.
Was the official line about drug trafficking anything more than a flimsy, politically convenient pretext? Or were oil, China's growing influence, and the weakening petrodollar the actual ultimate targets? And finally, what does this new display of big stick diplomacy, this overt assertion of unilateral dominance, what does it mean for the Western Hemisphere and, the future of U.S. power globally?
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the startling, precise events that unfolded in Caracas over the last 48 hours.
The initial reports we have, they paint a picture of a highly coordinated military strike. It began in the dead of night.
We're talking, 1 or 2 in the morning?
Exactly, around 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. local time on January 3rd. And sources on the ground describe the action not as some discreet raid, but as and this is a quote, full-scale unprovoked attack against Venezuela. The targets included the capital, Caracas, but also significant strikes in other states, Miranda, Aragua, and Lara. And this is a crucial point. It wasn't just a surgical special forces extraction. Sources confirmed the operation involved significant force. There are reports of civilian casualties and the deployment of genuine ordnance. We're talking bombs, not just precision strikes, which suggests a much wider objective than just grabbing one person.
That's right. And in the middle of it all, President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were, as the reports say, violently abducted and kidnapped by U.S. Special Forces personnel. They were immediately flown out of the country, and they're destined for the U.S.
And now they're slated to face charges in the Southern District of New York,
a jurisdiction that's pretty well known for handling high-profile international terrorism and drug cases.
And the stated legal pretext for this incredible violation of sovereign immunity, it was rolled out very quickly by Attorney General Pam Bondi.
She confirmed the charges. Narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and this one is interesting, conspiracy and possession of machine guns and destructive devices against the United States.
Okay, let's pause on that legal framework for a second. Because the charges themselves, they immediately generated this intense legal and political criticism globally. Sources from all over the political spectrum called the entire justification wildly illegal. One called it a phony anti-drug pretext for a straightforward imperial plunder.
Well, yeah, and we need to understand why. For any head of state, the concept of sovereign immunity is supposed to protect them from prosecution in foreign courts while they're in office.
Right, that's a cornerstone of international law.
It is. So charging a sitting head of state, even one the U.S. says is illegitimate, in a New York court is, it's legally unprecedented. And that charge about possessing machine guns is singled out as being particularly absurd.
I mean, he's the head of a country. Of course he has access to military hardware.
Exactly. Leaders, by definition, command military organizations. They have vast arsenals. So to base a legal justification for an invasion on a world leader having standard military equipment it's just a transparent attempt to manufacture criminality. The critics are arguing this whole legal structure was built just to legitimize the operation after the fact for domestic political consumption.
And the specific focus on drug allegations, sources suggest that was very specifically designed.
Oh, absolutely. It's meant to appeal to key domestic constituencies, particularly in Florida, which has always focused heavily on Caribbean drug routes.
So the initial strikes I read, they targeted alleged drug smuggling boats in the Caribbean.
They did. But here's the thing. The data just doesn't support Venezuela being a major HUD for U.S. drug importation. Colombia, Mexico. They dwarf Venezuela's role significantly. The war on drugs rhetoric here, it functions purely as a domestic political pretext. It's a way to get support for what was clearly an objective of regime change and resource control.
It's a classic tactic, isn't it? Dress up an economic war as some kind of moral crusade.
It is. But what remains truly stunning when you get past the pretext is the mechanical execution of the extraction. Or, maybe more accurately, the absolute failure of the Venezuelan defense forces.
For a pure tactical standpoint, military analysts we've seen are calling it exquisitely done.
It was. But the shocking component is that near total absence of any resistance.
Think about the imagery that came out. Slow-moving U.S. transport helicopters flying right across the Caracas skyline, completely unhindered, carrying out the extraction of the president.
And sources confirm there was no air defense whatsoever.
Despite the fact that Venezuela has significant Russian-provided air defense systems, we're talking about very capable assets.
Highly capable.
Yeah.
Man-pads, man-portable air defense systems, and the really formidable S-300 surface-to-air missile systems.
So the lack of deployment of even a basic shoulder-fired missile against a low-flying helicopter, that's just inexplicable under normal military circumstances.
In fact, some of the reports mention U.S. helicopters firing on air defense placements.
Which is a tactical absurdity if those placements were actually working. A helicopter versus a surface-to-air system is no contest.
Exactly. So the implication is profound. Either Venezuela's entire military hardware was completely non-operational because of maintenance and sanctions, which is possible.
Or something much more insidious was at play.
And the overwhelming consensus among our intelligence and geopolitical sources, it leans very heavily toward the latter. This was not a successful military operation overcoming stiff resistance. This was a massively successful covert intelligence operation.
Okay, walk us through that theory. If the military assets were available, why would they stand down?
The theory centers on the CIA's historical playbook. We're talking long-term, deep-cover operations, and they almost always involve significant financial incentives. The CIA, or, affiliated intelligence agencies, are suspected of systematically bribing key military leaders and government officials over a very long period.
And this all culminated in a prearranged stand-down order.
That's the theory. A stand-down order from within the government's top brass, ensuring that those S-300s were disabled, or that commanders simply refused to issue intercept orders.
So the operation succeeded because the defense structure was essentially rotten from the inside out.
Precisely. It suggests a prepared internal coup, where the physical military extraction was just the final, easy step. And this contrasts really sharply with previous overt attempts that failed. Remember the 2020 Keystone Cop plot?
Oh yeah, the one with the retired Green Berets on fishing boats. It was almost comical.
It was a highly visible, amateurish attempt that was easily crushed. This time, the fix was internal, it was surgical, and it was brutally effective.
And the details around Maduro's actual capture, they certainly lend some credence to that betrayal theory. The reporting suggests he was sleeping in his normal residence, not some secure bunker, when the forces breached the perimeter.
That's what the sources claim. That he tried to get to his safe room, a heavily fortified space, but he couldn't engage the security mechanism or open the door in time before the Special Forces team got to him. The ease with which they found him and accessed him in his own home, it strongly implies internal coordination.
Someone gave him the floor plans. Or the codes.
Possibly. It just speaks volumes about the level of deep infiltration that must have occurred.
So, moving to the immediate aftermath, the government structure, the whole Chavismo movement, it didn't just instantly collapse. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was quickly sworn in as interim president. And this is where the U.S. administration's rhetoric became fascinatingly contradictory. It really revealed their true priorities.
It was a shocking pivot, wasn't it? President Trump publicly threw the longtime U.S.-backed opposition figure Maria Corina Machado just casually under the bus. He stated she lacked the necessary support or respect within Venezuela to lead.
After years of propping her up.
Years. And instead, he spoke surprisingly favorably of Delcy Rodriguez, suggesting she was open to working with the U.S. He was essentially signaling that Washington was completely indifferent to who was in power as long as they were compliant.
That sounds like a clear, cold calculation. The goal was never about establishing democracy or supporting a specific person. The goal was securing economic compliance.
That is the consensus of our analysis, yes. The U.S. objective was resource transfer and economic reorientation. They were perfectly willing to work with the remnants of the Chavista government, provided the government agreed to Washington's economic demands.
And what has Rodriguez's response been?
Well, publicly, she immediately condemned the action as an illegal invasion. But critics suggest her ability to resist long-term U.S. pressure, especially with oil revenues as the ultimate bargaining chip, is highly limited.
Okay, so if the war on drugs was just the pretext, let's pivot now to what our sources are overwhelmingly identifying as the true underlying drive. Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where we get into high-stakes global economics.
The motivation was made explicit by the president himself. In his press conference after the operation, Trump was unusually blunt. He just abandoned the pretense entirely. He stated clearly, quote, "We want the oil."
He actually said that.
Word for word. Yeah. And he further announced that American personnel would be running the country until a transition could be implemented. That admission is just remarkable in its candor. It completely confirms that narrative of straightforward imperial plunder that the critics were putting forth.
And the economic logic behind this is, well, it's undeniable. For our listeners who might not remember, Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world. It's more than even Saudi Arabia. But years of mismanagement and, crucially, those suffocating U.S. sanctions have crippled their production.
And the plan that was announced was purely corporate-driven. The U.S. would bring in its largest multinational oil corporations, we are talking Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, to invest billions. These companies would come in, revamp the broken infrastructure, stabilize production, and, quote, start making money for the country.
Which effectively means repatriating those profits back into the U.S. corporate system.
Of course. And it's no surprise that these U.S. oil majors were, as one source put it, cheerleading this conflict. ExxonMobil has been covertly advocating for regime change for years, funding think tanks and lobbyists. ConocoPhillips have been actively suing the Venezuelan government.
And Chevron was still operating there, but under a pretty tight license, right?
They were. And they certainly wanted greater unrestricted access. So this action immediately validates the accusations from political critics that Americans are now being forced to work for ExxonMobil and potentially die for oil profits.
It's a very stark reminder of those deep ties between corporate donor interests and U.S. foreign policy. It really seems to show that the oil companies and defense contractors are dictating military action.
But securing oil, even the largest reserves in the world, is really only one layer of this onion. The source analysis suggests this action is intrinsically linked to a much larger structural crisis facing the U.S.
The accelerating decline of its economic hegemony, what some are calling the petrodollar crisis.
This is the strategic core of the entire operation. It makes it a high-stakes move for global financial control. For decades, the U.S. dollar has maintained its status as the world's primary reserve currency. It's called the exorbitant privilege.
And that's based on the agreement that oil has to be sold globally in dollars, right?
Exactly. An agreement often enforced through geopolitics since the 1970s.
And what does that exorbitant privilege actually allow the U.S. to do in practical terms?
It gives them immense power. It creates a permanent artificial global demand for U.S. currency, forcing every nation that buys energy to hold massive dollar reserves. This lets the U.S. print trillions out of thin air to fund massive deficits. It lets them effectively export inflation and debt abroad, shifting the economic burden onto other nations.
And Venezuela, as small as it is in the global economy, was playing a very dangerous catalytic role in dismantling that privilege.
Precisely. Venezuela was actively undermining the system. They were increasingly trading their vast oil resources in Chinese yuan, not U.S. dollars.
And that was accelerating this global trend of de-dollarization.
Hugely. Countries, especially major economies like China and India, are reducing their reliance on the dollar for trade, particularly energy trade. The raid on Caracas was a desperate geopolitical action to plug this specific financial dam.
So the message wasn't just, we want your oil, it was, we demand you sell your oil in our currency.
Exactly. By physically seizing the government, The U.S. ensures that the new compliant administration will immediately declare that Venezuela will honor all contracts in U.S. dollars. They'll likely repeg the unstable Venezuelan currency, the bolivar, to the U.S. dollar. This, and you can't put it any other way, this is forcing oil back into the dollar system at gunpoint. It's an action that starkly exposes the fragility of that economic empire when it can no longer compete on trade and has to rely on pure coercion.
This establishes a profoundly chilling global warning, doesn't it? I mean, every resource-rich nation is watching this. Brazil, Indonesia, vast parts of Africa with critical minerals.
The message is crystal clear, and it's delivered through the barrel of a gun. It's, if you try to leave the dollar system, if you try to sell your resources to our rivals in their currency, we will intervene militarily and seize your government. This act instantly validates every piece of anti-American aggression rhetoric from Russia and China, and it forces those fence-sitting nations to choose a side. It probably accelerates the formation of non-dollar trading blocs like BRICS.
Furthermore, this military action was immediately reinforced by this overt, almost shocking declaration of a new, aggressive imperial doctrine for the entire Western Hemisphere.
It was startling in its candor. Trump articulated this new posture by stating, quote, "American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be doubted again."
That has echoes of mission accomplished, doesn't it?
It does. It's an assertion of authority and finality, suggesting not just that the mission is done, but that a new era of enforcement has begun.
And sources are already labeling this new posture the Donroe Doctrine, suggesting it radically supersedes the centuries-old Monroe Doctrine.
The original Monroe Doctrine from 1823 was about keeping external European powers out of the Americas. This new Donroe Doctrine, as our sources interpret it, is an evolved, much more aggressive strategy of big stick diplomacy. It asserts the right of the U.S. not just to keep external powers out, but to internally dictate who runs the country, who profits from its resources, and how its trade is denominated. It's a return to naked, forceful hegemony.
If that's the new doctrine, let's look at the immediate fallout on the global stage. What does this mean for Russia and China, who had very deep stakes in Venezuela?
This action has delivered a major, immediate geopolitical defeat and a deep humiliation to both Moscow and Beijing. Venezuela was strategically vital to them. It was a satellite state, a major center for Chinese economic investment, and a foothold for U.S. adversaries, Russian intelligence, Iranian interests, even Hezbollah operations, all trying to destabilize U.S. influence in Latin America.
And the timing of the strike seems particularly calculated to maximize the damage to Beijing's standing.
It was a direct slap in the face. Our sources confirm a high-level Chinese delegation sent directly by President Xi Jinping was physically meeting with Maduro in Caracas just hours before the strikes began.
What were they there for?
They were there to sign hundreds of bilateral agreements for Chinese interests in the region, including a massive expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative 2.0.
So the attack wasn't just a military action, it was a diplomatic and economic ambush.
Absolutely. The attack on Maduro is seen as a deliberate interference, intended to control oil supply routes and stop China from accessing the cheap crude oil it desperately needs. U.S. blockades had already caused Venezuela's oil production, a key Chinese supply, to fall by 25%. Now the U.S. is effectively taking control of the tap. It's economic warfare executed by special forces.
The reaction from both Russia and China has been condemnation in the strongest terms, but what does that actually mean? Are they going to intervene?
No. I mean, neither country has the power projection capability, or frankly, the political will, to get into a hot conflict with the U.S. over Venezuela. It's too far away, it's indefensible for them. Their response, as predicted, will be asymmetric. It'll be accelerating their development of alternative global systems, strengthening BRICS, increasing trade of local currencies, maybe retaliating elsewhere on the map. And they will weaponize this diplomatically. They'll use it as proof of American belligerence for years to come.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this action isn't an isolated event, is it? It's part of a broader, connected conflict that the U.S. is waging globally in 2026.
That's the critical context. This is happening in parallel with sustained pressure on Russia over Ukraine and increasing economic confrontation with China. You just have to look at the key sectors. In the EV market, China's BYD is crushing Tesla. In AI, Chinese tech is advancing rapidly despite U.S. sanctions. This action in Caracas is just the military arm of a comprehensive strategy to push back aggressively on all fronts against what the U.S. sees as its declining global power.
Moving from the great powers to the neighborhood, this operation sends a brutal, unmistakable message to every nation in the Western Hemisphere.
The big stick is directed squarely at all the progressive and left-wing governments in Latin America that have dared to have an independent foreign policy.
Mexico, Cuba, Nicaragua, Brazil under Lula.
All of them. The action essentially tells them that the U.S. tolerance for any political divergence has completely ended.
And the threats weren't just implied, they were direct.
It's stunningly direct. President Trump issued public warnings, telling Colombia to watch your ass, implying future intervention if they don't comply. But the most immediate brutal target is Cuba,
which has been under a U.S. blockade since 1962 and was desperately dependent on that subsidized Venezuelan oil.
It was their lifeline, and the U.S. intends to completely cut that off. By installing a compliant government in Caracas, they can redirect all that oil away from Havana. This is pure economic warfare designed to starve the island nation out. It's a textbook demonstration of power without any restraint.
And what about the reaction from traditional U.S. allies? The U.S. acted without informing Congress, let alone partners like the European Union.
That lack of consultation is so critical. It shows a complete disregard for coalition politics. And the EU's official response, when it finally came, was described by many sources as absolutely laughable in its weakness. They said Maduro lacked legitimacy. They vaguely defended the idea of a peaceful transition.
But their commitment to international law was pretty flimsy. How so?
They criticized the violence, but only weakly called for international law to be respected now, going forward.
So after the fact.
Exactly. This post facto response, where they condemn the methods but accept the outcome, it highlights the complete collapse of the Western rule of law facade. They're unwilling to challenge the U.S. violation of sovereignty because they prioritize the alliance over any legal principle.
And that lack of consequence, that sets an incredibly dangerous precedent for the entire global system.
It does. If the United States can unilaterally snatch the head of state of a sovereign nation and put them on trial in New York, what rationale stops any other powerful nation from doing the same to a U.S. ally? Sources are asking. What stops Russia or China from snatching someone like Netanyahu, or even Putin himself, who already has an international arrest warrant?
The whole world order relies on the sanctity of borders and the immunity of heads of state. This just erased those concepts.
The U.S. has definitively demonstrated that there is no international treaty, no UN charter, no concept of law that will inhibit its actions if a vital economic or geopolitical interest is threatened. This is a formula for global chaos. Critics argue this will only accelerate the global move toward creating self-defense systems and maybe even validate the need for non-nuclear states to get nuclear weapons as the only reliable deterrent.
Let's pivot to the domestic dynamics here. The sheer speed and timing of this operation, analysts are heavily linking it to a domestic agenda, specifically distraction.
The timing is highly scrutinized. The operation happened just as two major domestic issues were hitting a crisis point. First, healthcare premiums for millions of Americans just spiked on January 1st, doubling, tripling in some cases, a huge public outcry. And second, the ongoing, highly embarrassing revelations from the unsealed Epstein files were just spinning out of control.
And what specific link are sources drawing between the Epstein files and the need for this distraction?
The sources claim the files contained information revealing that the president's own private club, Mar-a-Lago, had been a key hunting ground for Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. The suggestion is the scandal was about to become deeply personal and politically toxic. A major military action provides the ultimate high-drama distraction from both soaring domestic costs and politically compromising scandals.
We are also seeing, yet again, the consequences of unchecked executive power.
Absolutely. The president operated without any constraint from the 1973 War Powers Act, completely ignoring Congress. And Congress itself has been labeled by critics a doormat Congress, unwilling to do its constitutional duty. The result is the U.S. military is being used effectively as the president's private militia to pursue goals driven by personal and donor whims.
And I saw they released some sort of hype video celebrating the bombing strikes.
They did, set to the song Fortunate Son of All Things, which just illustrates the profound political detachment and arrogance involved here.
This action also creates a deep, immediate contradiction for a huge portion of the president's core support base.
It's a genuine dilemma for the America First Maggie constituency. I mean, they voted for him based on a core promise, ending forever wars, bringing troops home, getting the U.S. out of the costly, bloody regime change business.
But the reality is that he has gone back on every single one of those claims, hasn't he?
He has. He's continuing to fund the proxy war in Ukraine. He's threatening new wars against Iran. And now he's personally launched this full-scale attack and occupation in Venezuela. Critics are framing this as a profound betrayal of his base's anti-interventionist instincts.
And Why do these critics argue the base should feel so betrayed?
The argument is that these voters are now being forced to accept military action, where Americans will inevitably put their lives on the line to work for ExxonMobil, that they could be dying for oil profits and for the powerful donors who dictate policy through massive contributions. The analysis concludes that whether you vote for one polar opposite candidate or another, the outcomes in foreign policy are often identical because the real decision makers, the lobbyists, the oil companies, the defense contractors, they remain securely in charge.
And stepping back to the leadership factor itself, we have to consider the persistent analysis concerning the president's mental state, linking it directly to the impulsive nature of this whole operation.
This is a consistent concern voiced by mental health experts and analysts tracking his public behavior. They suggest he's exhibiting signs of paranoia and florid manifestations of dementia and psychopathology. They argue that the Venezuela operation is exactly the kind of unconstrained, high-stakes gamble you might expect from a leader exhibiting these symptoms.
How does that mental state translate into such a dramatic, destructive foreign policy action?
Well, doctors suggest that cognitive decline, particularly dementia, can lead to previously inhibited people acting out in paranoid and destructive and crazy ways, especially when they operate within a system where they have virtually absolute power and no guardrails.
Right.
So this combination of political grandiosity, the idea that he could just take over Venezuela and maybe buy Greenland next, and a demonstrably declining mental state, it makes the outcome of these grand impulsive schemes incredibly hard to predict.
He may feel elated now, celebrating what he sees as a military masterstroke, but the lack of an actual cohesive plan for the day after remains a massive, massive concern.
And that lack of planning immediately raises the risk of a long-term quagmire. Maduro may be gone, but the organizational structure of Chavismo, the defense minister, the powerful vice president, the entrenched military leadership, it all remains largely intact. The country risks descending into a long-term domestic insurgency or even a fragmented civil war.
Which could be fueled by existing paramilitary and narco-terrorist groups like the Colombian ELN.
Exactly, the National Liberation Army, which operates heavily across that porous Venezuelan-Colombian border.
And if the U.S. is forced to put significant boots on the ground to manage the chaos that follows, the consequences could be disastrous.
Absolutely. The president must be very afraid of putting boots on the ground, despite any initial bravado. History teaches us that this type of unilateral, unprovoked action in a complex political environment guarantees a deep-seated nationalist resistance. This means the immediate victory, however exquisitely it was executed, just sets up future Americans to pay the price for the arrogance that we're showing today. And that price will be measured in blood and treasure, forcing U.S. troops into what could quickly become an endless, low-level conflict.
So, to summarize the comprehensive analysis from our deep dive today, the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro was achieved not through military confrontation, but through the successful conclusion of a covert intelligence operation. It was enabled by internal corruption and a military stand-down.
And that tactical success masks the true, fundamental strategic goal: a desperate geopolitical and economic effort to protect the U.S. dollar's hegemony and secure the world's largest oil reserves from rivals, first and foremost China. The whole operation was a declaration that the U.S. will use military force to enforce its economic will.
But despite the shock of the swift capture, the sources are indicating that the Venezuelan resistance, the heart of the Chavismo movement and its populist base, is far from over.
That is critical to remember. The resistance is expected to shift from conventional military action to a decentralized, daily, humble struggle at the grassroots level. Analysts are calling it a civil-military alliance.
Yeah.
And the Venezuelan people have demonstrated incredible resilience before. They overcame a near-total collapse of their oil revenue from U.S. sanctions in 2020. They are now expected to close ranks around a national defense narrative to preserve their nation from foreign corporate takeover.
Which brings us back to the global order. The unavoidable precedent set here is the most critical long-term takeaway, isn't it?
Yes, the United States has demonstrated, through what critics have correctly labeled ruthless gangsterism, that it is willing to seize the assets, the governments, and the leaders of sovereign nations without any regard for international law or the UN Charter. This aggressive, lawless action significantly accelerates the global move toward creating alternative economic systems, BRICS, the SBO, bilateral non-dollar trading, as nations realize the West's legal system cannot protect them from this kind of coercion.
So the ultimate question remains, and it's the one we leave you with today. The U.S. has definitively won the rapid surgical battle for Caracas. They've secured immediate access to oil and perhaps temporarily shored up the dollar. But by demonstrating such ruthless, lawless action against a sovereign nation, has it permanently lost the infinitely more important global war for trust, credibility, and long-term soft power influence? That is the crucial question that will define global politics for the rest of this decade. Thank you for joining us for this special deep dive into the shocking, complex events unfolding in Venezuela. Subscribe to our channel for more breaking news and press like if you liked our news analysis.